It's good to see so many friends again from far and near. My name is Matthew Gerlach, Dr. Matthew Gerlach, the Vice President for Character, Virtue, and Ethics here at St. Mary's University of Minnesota. Welcome to the Spring 2024 Cardinal Virtue Lecture. Today we're honored to have with us Dr. Robert Enright to speak to us about the virtue of forgiveness and its relationship to the cardinal virtue of justice. Shortly after the arrival of our 14th President, Father James P. Burns, IVD, Ph.D., Cardinal Virtue Lecture Series speakers and topics are chosen to create thought-provoking dialogue among faculty, staff, and students as St. Mary's cultivates in its learners the virtues that will guide them throughout their educational journey and as they enter the world as leaders in their professions and communities. Occasionally, lectures in the series are offered virtually, like this one, to reach members of all our campuses, as well as our alumni, benefactors, and others farther away. Last fall, we had two Cardinal Virtue Lecture speakers. In September, we had Dr. Liz Gulliford from the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues speak on the relationship between the virtue of gratitude and human flourishing. Then in October, we had the former Minnesota Viking and Super Bowl champion, speaker and author, Mr. Matt Burke, speak on life as sport. Since life, like sport, requires the relentless practice of the fundamentals, in this case, the four cardinal virtues. Earlier speakers have included Dr. Catherine Pakalik, Eleanor Stump, Candace Vogler, Peter Kreeft, and Bill Thierfelder. Today, we're honored and blessed, really, to have with us Dr. Bob Enright. Dr. Robert Enright, a licensed psychologist, is the founder of the International Forgiveness Institute and has been called the Forgiveness Trailblazer by Time magazine. He holds the Aristotelian Professorship in Forgiveness Science within the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I believe he's been there for over 45 years. Enright's work includes the first scientific study on person-to-person forgiveness and publishing research on forgiveness therapy with his 20-step process model of forgiving. In 2022, he received the APF Gold Medal Award for Impact in Psychology, recognized as psychology's highest award by the American Psychological Association. Today, Dr. Enright will be exploring the often uneasy relationship between the cardinal virtue of justice on the one hand and the virtue of forgiveness on the other. Now I'll hand things over to Dr. Enright and invite him to unmute and begin his presentation. Welcome, Dr. Enright.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you very much, St. Mary's University of Minnesota, for having me. And the title is Forgiveness as a Virtue, Friend or Foe of Justice. And the reason that this is important is people oftentimes confuse forgiveness. They think it is a caving in to others. As I say in this particular slide here, I've talked in 14 invited lectures in a particular place in a conflict zone, which I won't mention because they've yelled at me 14 times. I'm 14 out of 14, everybody, with being yelled at. And they usually point a finger at me and say, justice first. And they see forgiveness as dangerous. So my point here is to see if, in fact, you agree with that, or whether you see perhaps a synergy between forgiveness and justice. It seems to me that forgiveness and justice, as moral virtues, can and should exist together in communities. And if that's true, that they find their life in communities, let's first examine what a community is. From Jacques Maritain, I've learned that a community is a single whole entity with a common purpose. And that's for each individual to live within that community and to actually embellish that entire community. A community is not simply the sum total of individuals within it. I learned this from Peter Kreeft, who gave one of these lectures. He talks about the symphony, and not everyone plays the same instrument in the same way at the same time. They work together in harmony. That's what a community is. It's to deliberately work together in harmony with one another. And the group actually transcends any part of the group, like happens in a symphony orchestra. And certainly communities differ in their norms, beliefs, actions, what Aristotle calls an accident. There's something common to communities, but also cultural and specific differences. Aristotelian realist philosophy, again, I hold the Aristotelian professorship, so I am an adherent of Aristotle's philosophy because I think it's the most complete in the whole world when it comes to the moral virtues. He states that the communities all have a common good as a goal, as an endpoint. A common good is defined by Plato in his seminal work, The Republic, as persons growing in the cardinal virtues, as you see in this slide. And what are the cardinal virtues? Justice, courage, wisdom, and temperance. And they're all emphasized in the group. These four virtues, in Plato's view, are not generated by feelings inside. They exist naturally, and they exist naturally to be appropriated in every community. Doesn't mean we do it, but that's the goal, that's the end point for communities to grow in justice, courage, wisdom, and temperance. Obviously, the people that yell at me think that forgiveness gets in the way of all of that because it thwarts justice. And justice is considered the most prominent, most important of all of the cardinal virtues, by the way, right, in the Republic. And as Wilde says, the goal of the common good is your and my individual human perfection for the good of the community. So the common good of the community, which includes the good of each person, you and I, growing in these cardinal virtues, is considered actually higher than individual good isolated unto itself. In other words, individuals can be in service to one another for good and in service to the group. So think of it as the individual and the group existing together in harmony, where we don't choose one or the other here. So then, what's the definition of each cardinal virtue if they're so terribly important? I've done my learning from Aristotle and the great Peter Kraft. Justice is offering one's best. If you're a carpenter, you offer the best table. If you're a tennis player, you offer the best backhand. If you're a musician, you offer the best violin solo, okay? And again, the best important cardinal virtue is justice. Courage is going ahead despite fear so that you can get things done in the community. Wisdom is knowing the right response at the right time without having a rule book nearby. And temperance, and this is very important for how forgiveness everybody fits into community. Temperance is what the Aristotelians and the Platonic tradition call balance, avoiding extremes, too much or too little of anything, including the moral virtues themselves, okay? Including work, pleasure seeking. And in Book 4 of his seminal work, The Republic, Plato defends the view that all four of these cardinal virtues together help to mature individuals and to have a well-functioning community in which the greater good of all and for the individuals in the community can indeed work best. So what about the person in relation to the community? Budashevsky in 1997 made the philosophical point that all persons are special, unique, and irreplaceable. Everyone possesses inherent worth. The atheists can believe that. We all have unique DNA, except for identical twins, but even they are different by their different world experiences. Those who are of monotheistic faith can believe this because each one is made in the image and likeness of God, which makes us special and makes us irreplaceable. And of course, the soul would make you unique. So whether it's the atheistic position or the spiritual, traditional religious perspective, Budashevsky seems to have it correct, that we all are special, unique, and irreplaceable as persons. And this is very important in the community. Why? Well, if the persons, these individuals who are unique and irreplaceable, are less important than the group, then the group leaders might become very controlling to achieve the group ends at the expense of individuals. See how they both have to work together? If all persons are ends in and of themselves, which Immanuel Kant said in 1785 in the Genealogy of Morals, then persons are not means to the ends of anyone's goal or any community goal. In other words, and according to Plato in the Republic, people should strive to be just to each person in the community because we're acknowledging on the top of the slide the specialty, the uniqueness, and the irreplaceability of each person. And so there actually is considered an ordering of rights of what is fair and how to treat fairness in communities. First, there are the individual rights of the person and the family, and then come the community rights. But again, with both Wilde and Maritain thinking, community rights must not take over so that the individual and family rights are squelched. And so here we go with regard to the very important question about forgiveness, right here in this slide. Forgiveness actually can keep the cardinal virtues in balance, avoiding extremes. I want to repeat that because it's missed by all those people who yell at me in that particular conflict zone of the world, 14 out of 14. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle talks about the balance of the virtues. Each moral virtue is bounded by two vices, one of which is an underrepresentation and the other is an excess of the virtue. For example, justice is the mean, the balance between acquiescence or caving in. That's what the people who yell at me think forgiveness would do, you see. They think you're caving in to the dominance of the other. But justice is the mean between that and excessive demand. Courage is the mean between weakness or fear and the underrepresentation of courage and what I'm calling reckless bravado, where you way overdo it, which is the excessive expression of courage, okay, as examples. How does forgiveness balance the cardinal virtues? Here we go again with an answer of them fitting together in a synergy. When people are treated unjustly by others, we find in psychology and psychiatry that anger can actually start, build up, and become excessive. The anger can become imbalanced or intemperate and lead even to hatred. And the hatred, of course, can lead to conflict, which can lead to all-out war, which we're seeing on the planet today. Forgiving those who are unjust then can actually reduce the hatred, the irritability, even the smaller anger, which in turn can reduce the desire for excessive recompense so that justice is brought into balance. It can reduce the desire for reckless bravado, where we don't take up arms against others, especially the defenseless and those who have no fight against you. But extremes can lead to moral blindness in that way. And without the hatred, with temperance restored, and with clear rational thinking of wisdom, we now have the cardinal virtues in a balance that might let us think better, behave better, and feel better toward those who have made us so angry. Okay? When the unhealthy anger is not reduced, right, research shows us that anxiety can go above normal, psychological depression can ensue. Now, this is when anger gets over the top, gets excessive, gets intemperate. Relationship problems can occur, addiction can occur, and serious crime connected with being unjustly treated as a child can be displaced onto others. Can you see how the excessive anger itself can disrupt the community by disrupting the cardinal virtues? Anger, in its excess, is an enemy of community harmony. It is an enemy of justice seeking. Right? So what do we do then with this? Forgiveness and the common good within communities can operate this way. If the common good is to be just to others, to work in harmony with others, then forgiveness can keep justice in balance. How? By first reducing the toxic anger and thus preserving this cardinal virtue, the central cardinal virtue. It can actually pull the quest for justice back to an evenness rather than saying, you owe me a pound of flesh, as Shakespeare put it. And if this is true, then forgiveness needs to play a part, a central part, in the common good of communities. Oh, really? Where's that in Plato? Well, you know what? Plato missed it. Right? Sadly, Plato missed the fifth cardinal virtue. And I'm suggesting that without that, there's a difficult road back when the cardinal virtues are no longer in harmony. I really think the Republic needed a chapter on what we do when the intemperance occurs. See, that's where forgiveness plays its part in pulling all of the moral virtues, particularly justice, back to their normal level of what? What's justice? Trying to do your best with your gifts in the community to give of yourself so that we're all giving our particular gifts for the harmony of the community. So if this is true, then forgiveness itself needs to be fostered deliberately, consciously, as a norm in individuals, in families, in schools, workplaces, yes, universities, and even places of worship. It's very, very important. So what do we mean by forgiveness, everybody? What do we mean by it? Well, in modern Western world, people will tell you that forgiveness is whatever I think it is. They degenerate into a relativism that obscures what forgiveness is. If you and I and everybody in the world walks around with their own definition of forgiveness, then we're not talking with one another about the same thing. So how can we pull justice back to a temperate, reasonable way if we line up 10 people and we all have 10 different definitions of forgiveness? You know what we need? We need an objective view of what forgiveness is, to which all of us can agree at least to a degree. First of all, forgiveness is a choice. That's what I like about it. I've never seen a law anywhere in the world that says you must forgive or you go to jail. I like that because it shows that you have to be drawn to forgiveness. You have to will it through your own free will. It's up to you, and nobody should force you to do it. If you don't like it, don't taste the apple of forgiveness. If you do like it, eat the apple. Forgiveness is a moral virtue. Aristotle called it magnanimity, or largeness of heart, which we try to deliberately give to others for their good. Because that's what any moral virtue is. It's goodness toward others for their good. What is justice again? Remember, if you're a carpenter, what do? You build a table for whom? For others' good, right? If you're patient with someone, who is it for? The other. Forgiveness, therefore, as a moral virtue, is for the other. So the big question is, who's that? Well, when I study, I'm an egghead professor, remember everybody, I study everything I can about forgiveness. And I've tried to study it from the Hebrew, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Confucian views of what forgiveness is. I see a commonality. across all of these different ancient texts. And by the way, all talk favorably about forgiveness. They don't have a bad word about forgiveness. The negatives about forgiveness actually began to blossom in the late 1800s with Friedrich Nietzsche, for example. And so here's a definition of forgiveness that I do think an atheist, a humanist, a Jewish person of different kinds of Judaism, Christianity, different kinds, Islam, different kinds, Buddhism, different kinds, could all pretty much agree on this definition of forgiveness. 3 particular points and then a 4th one. When we forgive, there are 3 major components. Number 1, we've been treated unjustly by another person or persons. We strive to get rid of the negative, which is resentment. And here's where it gets controversial, everybody. We strive as best we can to gulp, gasp, do I dare say it, offer goodness of some kind to the one who hurt us. How crazy is that? This goodness can take the form of kindness, respect, generosity, even love toward the one who's hurt us. And agape love is the highest form of forgiveness. Why? The person who is hurt and decides through free will to forgive is reaching out in suffering toward the injurer, and this costs the one forgiving. I guess I can see why I get yelled at a lot when you see this definition, right? Sounds a little strange. But when we look at what forgiveness is not, it starts, again, being put in balance as really a virtue rather than something that crushes justice. Forgiveness is not excusing. If you've been hurt by another, and it was 10 years ago, that is still unfair. What happened to you was unfair, is unfair, and it will always be fair. You don't excuse what is wrong. You're reaching out is toward the person, right? Never excusing what happened. You don't forget. People use the term forgive and forget, but we remember in new ways. We look back without the rancor, without the hatred building up in our heart. It's more than calming down. Why? You can calm down and still hate a person. And once you're off the couch with your potato chips and you're up and running again, that hate can build up again. Okay, so it's more than that. It's reaching out to a person, not just your own muscles relaxing. Forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation. Do you know why? Reconciliation is not a moral virtue. It's a negotiation strategy between 2 or more people. Did you know you can forgive without reconciling if the person keeps abusing you? And forgiveness is not abandoning the quest for justice. Forgiveness can fit into the community so that justice begins to blossom more. And my buddy Aristotle reminded me to never practice any of the moral virtues in isolation from the others because they can get distorted. For example, if you're a courageous non-swimmer and lack wisdom, you might jump into the lake to save a drowning dog only to drown yourself because you didn't use wisdom to say, I don't know how to swim, but you use courage. Wisdom and courage together would allow you to call 911. Okay? So you don't abandon the quest for fairness. You let fairness and forgiveness grow up together. Why? Because forgiveness can keep justice in balance when it's going over the edge because of excessive anger, excessive how dare you. Forgiveness can pull you back to harmony. So when people forgive, here's what they do. They try to widen their view of who the offending person is by seeing the person as special, unique, and irreplaceable, and that takes time. You slowly, as you begin to see the inherent worth in the other, you begin to see the woundedness in the other. You begin to see that the person is special and unique and irreplaceable. The person has worth that can't be taken away. You slowly develop a softer heart toward the person when you think these ways. And thinking these ways of the woundedness in the other, maybe that's one reason why the person wounded you, a history of woundedness, and it's being special, unique, and irreplaceable, and having inherent worth. And if you're a person of faith, you know the person is made in the image and likeness of God, which can take a while if your heart is hurting. You slowly develop a softer heart that we call compassion, a willingness to suffer along with the other person. And when the person gets strong enough for that, we ask the person who's forgiving to stand in the pain, bear the pain. Why? So you don't throw the pain back to that other person or unsuspecting others. If you bear the pain, you won't go home and kick the cat. You won't go home and yell at the kids or your partner. You see, when you bear the pain, it might seem like you're going to have it with with you for the rest of your life, but no. When you bear the pain, the paradox is it begins to lessen. And eventually, and it can take months when people do the process of forgiving, to fulfill the theme of forgiveness being a moral virtue, we ask people to gulp, gasp again, give a gift of some kind to the offending person. It seems rather ridiculous, but forgiveness asks you to maybe pick up the phone or an email correspondence that has waited years, maybe months, or a kind word about the person to others, or donating charity in the person's name. You're giving a gift to the other because forgiveness is about mercy, everybody. Forgiveness is about being merciful to the other, but the highest part being loving the other by helping bring out the best good in the other, even when it's hurting you to do so. And eventually, you experience a second paradox. What's the first paradox? When you bear the pain leaves. Eventually, the second paradox is as you give to the other through a broken heart, you yourself begin to heal emotionally in your own heart. So what's the evidence scientifically that forgiveness heals people who do the forgiving? Well, we have a number of studies. I'll go through them quickly with you. We worked with, Suzanne Friedman and I worked with incest survivors, adult incest survivors, for 14 months, once a week for an hour, until they said they have forgiven. At first, they said, I won't forgive the father or father figure, because it's one of the most severe injustices in the world. A father figure who's supposed to protect violates. And they came to us psychologically depressed and anxious, low hope. And you know who they didn't like? Themselves. After 14 months, compared to the control group who didn't have this yet, the forgivers went from clinically depressed to non-depressed. You know who they ended up liking? Themselves. You see, they changed the script of who they are. When we're treated unjustly by others, there's a tendency to believe the lie. Forgiveness reverses it. Gail Reed and I worked with emotionally abused women following divorce, and similar issues happened, and they ended up liking themselves. We worked with men on a cardiac unit, screened them for deep injustices against them. Even years earlier, they learned to forgive. More blood flow through the heart when they started thinking about that incident again. Because you see, when you're very, very angry, science tells us when you have heart damage, the arteries to the heart begin to narrow and you get less blood flow. And so Dr. Douglas Russell said the forgiveness helped these men avoid sudden death and chest pains. We've worked with terminally ill, elderly women, cancer patients, only 4 weeks, not 14 months, because they were dying. And when they forgave, one woman forgave incidents in the family from 40 years ago. Some of the women drew their family to the bedside and they did reconcile, and their sense of hope increased. We did a study of at-risk adolescent females in South Korea. They became emotionally healthier, and their academic achievement went up. We worked with emotionally and sexually abused adolescent females in Pakistan, same thing. A year later, after the forgiveness therapy was done, a year after it ended, they were filled with greater hope and forgiveness and lower anger. The control group was losing their hope. They needed forgiveness therapy. Why? To pull them back to more justice, to more courage, to more wisdom. Lower anger can occur when a person says yes to forgiveness. And there's one what we call meta-analysis, where you look at a lot of studies together, and Akhtar and Barlow did that with 15 different studies. And they found that those who had forgiveness themes definitely reduced their emotional stress, and it promoted more positive emotions when they looked at 15 different studies in different places in the world. The science is telling us that when people forgive, good things can happen by making them more temperate, even in their emotional well-being. So then, everybody, how do we bring forgiveness into communities for good? How do we do it? For Aristotle, this question is what he calls the efficient cause, how we bring it in. What brings forgiveness into communities? I have a few bullet points here for you to consider. We're aware that forgiveness needs to be part of a community. Let's make it a norm. Okay? Justice is a norm. As soon as a 5-year-old goes into kindergarten and the teacher says, "Take the gum out of your mouth, Johnny," what's that? That's justice theme. Line up, everybody. Oh, you're out of line. Get in line. That's a justice theme. Justice becomes a norm very, very quickly in society. We need forgiveness as a norm. We have to be aware that the forgiveness itself, when practiced as a norm, can revitalize the cardinal virtues, torn down by injustice. Injustice is an enemy of the common good because it really skews all of the cardinal virtues together. As we develop a love of this virtue, Aristotle tells us, and we do so with practice, then there's more of a tendency to plant it more deeply and more seriously as a common good. And we put into practice opportunities. We have to deliberately seek them out for understanding, appreciating, and appropriating the moral virtue of forgiveness in our different smaller communities of families, schools, workplaces, universities, and houses of worship. Okay? We've done this in schools. We had over 100 teachers, 107, report to us after they did forgiveness education. And 78% of these 107 said the students actually increased in cooperation in the classroom community as a result of learning about forgiveness. Why? They wouldn't bully each other so much anymore. They wouldn't disrespect those they see as having inherent worth. It increased cooperation and reduced their anger. Look at this one. 93% of the instructors, 93% of them said that the teachers themselves became better persons as a result of teaching about the forgiveness in a curriculum. 84% of the instructors that the classroom as a whole began to function better, academically and socially. Because you see, if you don't have all this anger in your heart, the students they'll pay more attention. If their heart's hurting, they're not going to know what 3 + 3 is, and they're not going to care. So we need to do rehabilitation of the heart, even for them to engage in regular learning. And what are some of the outcomes of forgiveness education? Well, we did 1st and 5th grade in Milwaukee, less anger, and there was a reduction in prejudice in one of our Milwaukee studies. Right? Very segregated community, Milwaukee. 1st grade in Belfast, Northern Ireland, they came to us on the average with levels of anger close to clinical levels. They engaged in forgiveness education through stories, learning about story characters. What happened? Their anger went to normal levels. Same thing 3rd grade in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And they increased also in their well-being by decreasing, on the average now, psychological depression. See, in communities that have been in conflict, even the idea of depression for 9-year-olds is possible, sadly. We've worked with at-risk middle school students who were really close to failing in school. They had on an A, B, C, D, F kind of a report card. They were in a D level. We worked with those who had deep injustices against them. They became healthier and they went to a C+ average, above average. And the same thing I just mentioned happened in South Korea. And we just recently completed a study in Iran in the three largest cities there with four ethnic groups that don't get along very well. And those in the experimental group compared to the control group, again, teaching forgiveness through stories, showed higher degrees of forgiving, just like in Belfast and in Milwaukee. And they had lower levels of ethnic prejudice because you see, they began seeing others with whom they're disagreeing and where there's tension. They're beginning to see the humanity in the other because forgiveness, remember, widens your lens, widens your vision of who the other is as a person. And who is that person? Someone who is unique, special, irreplaceable, and has inherent built-in worth, right? There's state anger, trade anger. State is current anger, trade anger is ongoing anger, and how you express anger all went down statistically significantly at post-test and follow-up, okay? The study in reducing ethnic prejudice and anger is setting the stage, at least eventually, for the common good to develop within and across these communities where they're not getting along very well. We had an application in the workplace in London where we screened people, white-collar workers, 41 of them, who were quite angry and quite anxious in work because of things not going well. They went through a forgiveness program, widening their lens. Lo and behold, their ongoing anger or their ongoing anxiety, and their current level of anger when they sit at their desk went down statistically significantly. We're creating even better workers. Okay? So how do we appropriate forgiveness to bring the common good now within universities? How about that? Why don't we think about that? Why don't we think about St. Mary's University of Minnesota? Why don't we do that for a minute? And let's first of all consider the wisdom of Anthony Esolen, who works at a small college on the East Coast. He recently had an essay in The Catholic Thing. And here's this quote at the bottom of the page. You cannot really be free to think about the common good when everyone is shouting at each other. You cannot read a love poem, giving to others, in other words, if you are huddled in a shell of self-regard, feeling your sores, and you cannot face the world in a spirit of giving unless you cease to face yourself. In other words, an excessive self-focus and what about me, rather than including in your equation, what about you as well? So why forgiveness in universities anyway, everyone? Well, social harmony within a group can be affected by the injustice occurring within that group. This is the case because unjust treatment toward individuals in the group, disrespect, for example, are constantly fighting each other, constantly shouting at each other, as Anthony Esolen says, it can increase anger. The anger can lead, as we've seen, to an imbalance in all of the cardinal virtues, toward the self, students, coworkers, and others. This can lead to a breakdown of the common good in the university. And what's that going to do to learning? What's that going to do to individual hearts? Forgiveness itself, in reducing anger and bringing the cardinal virtues back into balance, can restore the common good. It can restore fair play, listening to one another, openness to rational debate, rather than the closing down of dialogue, which I have seen on university campuses. And it can open up the idea of freedom of expression and honest debate, rather than saying, I'm going to overpower you, so be quiet. Where does that lead us? The person who says that, is that person growing in humanity? Are you allowing the other person to grow in humanity? What about the social harmony of different ideas? A violin and a cello working together in terms of differences of opinion. We need more of that on university campuses. So where do we start? Well, to enhance the community of forgiving in a university, we must start today. Well, how about yesterday? With each person individually encouraged to practice the moral virtue of forgiving. We need to establish that as a norm in universities, with an eye toward then growing in the cardinal virtues. And let's not forget the theological virtues, everybody, especially at St. Mary's University of Minnesota. Let's follow Thomas Aquinas. He called it charity. And let's follow the theological virtue, especially of charity, agape love, or serving others even when it's hard to do so. To reach out to others even if our heart is frustrated. To reach out to others even if we're angry with them because they're voting for person X rather than person Y. And we need to provide opportunities for forgiveness to grow. That's the efficient cause that Aristotle talked about. We have to deliberately provide creatively efficient causes within universities. So then, I asked the question as we started this lecture, is forgiveness the friend or foe of justice? What do you think Aristotle would say? If you think Aristotle would say we take a scissors between those two, he would say you're not thinking philosophically deeply enough. Why? Because I can hear him say, I told you that we have to have the moral virtues grow up together. And what happens when justice is divorced from forgiveness? It can degenerate into an excess of control, an excess of power, or the opposite of lying down and say, walk on my face, please. Forgiveness puts it back into balance where we look for a fairer justice. What would those who have not given the philosophical reflection like this say? Like they've said to me before, Enright, sit down and shut up. Okay? But I usually have the counter idea to them before I sit down and shut up, which I never have, by the way. So where do we start at St. Mary's University? Where should we start? St. Mary's University of Minnesota might begin to see itself, have you ever thought about this, everybody? As a just and merciful academic community. And those of you listening online who are not part of St. Mary's, how about your own community? How about your own house of worship? Or if you teach in a school, what about that school being a just and merciful school? St. Mary's might consider a motto among many others you have. I like this motto. Here's a quote. We give of ourselves for the common good of all. That would make some people stop in their tracks. What does that mean? We give of ourselves for the common good of all. Well, it means we reach out in love, even if we're frustrated, even if we disagree, where we respect, but we don't let the other walk all over our face, nor do we try to overpower the other. And sadly, that happens way too often these days. So what are the challenges facing us? How many people in a given community, contemporary society anywhere in the world can pass a test on what is meant by the common good of society? I bet you most people would fail the test. Why? We haven't brought it into our communities. We've lost a sense of growth in the moral virtues. They've become bad words. Okay? But virtues are about strength and purpose and meaning in life, and individual good and common good and harmony. And some people consider virtues to be a bad word. We have lost a sense that we literally can grow in our humanity. Right? I think we've lost that sense. Humanity is what is made up of flesh and DNA and bones. Oh, really? There's nothing more to that? How about, even Aristotle would use this word, how about the soul? Right? Forgiveness is so far off the radar for most people that its definition is vague. What is it again? Injustice, get rid of the negative, like resentment, and offer the positive, such as love. We need a resurgence of thinking as philosophers, even if we're not majoring in it. And we need to pass this along to others, and as soon as possible. There's cause for hope. For the philosophical materialists, the atheists, they now can talk about forgiveness through science. Thus, the realist philosopher, that'd be the Aristotelians, the theologians, Augustinians, the Thomists, okay, the materialist atheists can all sit down now and discuss the moral virtue of forgiveness and be pretty much in agreement as to what it is and how to apply it and how to grow in it and to appropriate it for the common good. We at the International Forgiveness Institute, and my work as a professor, led to self-help books where people in the general public can pick these up and follow along a forgiveness pathway. We have a therapeutic manual for mental health professionals, and we have forgiveness education curricula for age 4 to 18. We can put them into schools yesterday. And you know what? We cannot afford to wait. So thank you for putting up with me, everybody, and I'm ready to entertain your questions, doubts, difficulties, or anything at all.
Thank you, Dr. Enright. Thank you so much for your presentation today. We do have several questions from the audience. I'm going to start with this one. Could you explain a little bit more of why forgiveness develops a negative connotation only in the late 19th century? Why didn't earlier Enlightenment thinkers see it as a weakness as they shed moral constraints, for example?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think they were perhaps so busy saying that humanity must be redefined as freedom, and it has to be defined as my following my own path, that forgiveness was not part of that equation, which is a giving of myself to others for their sake, regardless of how I feel about it. Okay? And so I think the deconstructing of the religious worldview and our commonality there and the individualism led to almost a natural tendency to let forgiveness fall away. The skepticism started to arrive, of course, in the mid-1800s when you see materialism, the philosophy of materialism coming in, and then Nietzsche's idea that forgiveness is, he called it a monkish virtue. So I think it took a while for the philosophy of individualism to develop into the idea that even if I am to reach out to others as a norm, that actually is a usurpation of my freedom. Don't do it to me. And so it's spiraled. And that spiraling, I think, is still with us. That's why I'm yelled at 14 out of 14. And it has led to a grave distortion as to what forgiveness is, and we have to reclaim it in its essence.
So that excessive emphasis on my power and my freedom, my rights, can actually be contrary to our own health as well as the community, the common good of the communities in which we participate.
Jean-Paul Sartre, he said, freedom is the bottom line for humanity. And he said that can lead to despair, but that's the price you pay. Even if it leads to despair, that would be negative well-being. He said, I'm willing to pay that price for freedom. Okay? But of course, if you take a Catholic view of this, or even an Aristotelian view of this, what we're really seeing is he has misdiagnosed, misdefined what freedom is. Freedom is the unshackled way of doing what we ought. And I'm quoting Saint Pope John Paul II on that. So freedom isn't following my own path, even if it leads to despair. It's being unshackled to now be able to say yes to doing as I ought. And what is the as I ought? The theological and cardinal virtues, right? And of course, forgiveness is implied, embedded in the theological virtue of charity. Right.
And ought there is also about what leads to my flourishing, the flourishing of the communities in which I'm a part of too. So it's not just like doing what I ought in my freedom, but the freedom that gives me the power to thrive, to flourish individually and in the communities.
Individually and corporately, exactly. Corporately. Because see, if I'm thriving, I can then give you my best. Mm-hmm. And if I give you my best, you benefit. And if you do the same, then our community benefits. But if we're all off in our own little corner doing our own thing and in despair, where's the common good there? Mm-hmm. We need to challenge that philosophy.
Got another question. This one's about forgiveness, mercy, compassion, and I'm going to throw in there empathy because empathy is brought up a lot, and I think it's implied at least in some of the model that you presented today. But you said that forgiveness and mercy work together. How does compassion fit in the equation? And then I'd say also how does empathy fit into the equation? Because I think it's pretty clear that there's a place for these, but maybe if you could flesh that out a little bit.
Yes, compassion is suffering along with the other. Okay, so that actually I find comes a little later than the cognitive. See, that's a feeling so much. It's more of a feeling than a thought. And that, in our view, in our pathway of forgiveness, does come, but it comes after the thinking exercises. And the thinking exercises are beginning to see the full humanity in the one who hurt you, rather than denigrating that person and defining that person only by those actions. And as you do that, you are literally stepping inside the shoes of that person. You're getting to know that person better, and that's empathy. And see, empathy can be morally neutral. You can step inside the shoes of another person in order to say, I want to see this person's weaknesses so I can exploit. See, so empathy is not necessarily going to fit into the moral virtue side of things. And so we add the question, what should we now do in a positive way now that we've seen this person more fully? But as we see the person more fully, you know what we oftentimes see? Woundedness. And as we see that, we tend to develop not just an empathy, but a sympathy for the other, which makes us sometimes feel somewhat sorry for how this person is living this person's life, which isn't very productive for this person or those around this person. And so as we soften our heart toward the other, we see someone who is stumbling, perhaps in more error than should be. And that then grows in us that compassion, which reaches out to, I want to help this person if it's safe and if this person is willing to accept my gift.
Similarly, there's a question about how stories play a role in spreading forgiveness and forgiveness education. So you stated forgiveness education can be done by use of stories. Can you talk about what that is like? How does that work? Yeah.
Well, Aristotle told us, he didn't have television sets, or he didn't have Google back then. He told us that we can learn a lot by well-written plays. And so he was a fan of going to the theater because you can see people in interaction with one another with heightened conflicts and then how they resolve the conflicts. Well, we do the same thing, for example, in first grade, where we introduce Horton Hears a Who. There's a popular movie on that, and of course, a book by Dr. Seuss. And the theme in Horton Hears a Who is his statement, a person's a person, no matter how small. See, that's widening the lens of who the who's were. There were tiny little people on a little flower, and the jungle animals didn't think they existed even. And if they did, they were not like them, so they wouldn't see the inherent worth. And what was Horton teaching us there? He was teaching us how everyone is special, unique, and irreplaceable. He was teaching us how everyone has worth. So when the 6-year-olds, wide-eyed, listen to this story, they see, oh, all people have worth, and eventually we play it to ask the question, well, what if someone has less money than you? Do they have worth? What if you can kick a ball farther than someone else? Do you have more worth than that other person? And then we eventually move toward, even if someone behaves badly, let's say steals your pencil, do they still have worth? Is that still a person? And they can look at you wide-eyed. Oh boy, I guess so. And that's where you move into the level of forgiveness. But you don't start with forgiveness because that's much harder a concept than to say, my brother who likes me is also a person, no matter how small, even though he might be shorter than I am. And see, eventually we have to grow into the moral virtue of forgiveness because it may be the hardest moral virtue on the planet. Why? You are being good to someone through your broken heart. And so Horton Hears a Who sets us up for that eventually. And the children, when they see that story, when we give them a forgiveness scale, focusing on someone who's hurt them, these children actually have less resentment, more goodness reported on forgiveness in real life, in real time, with real people who've hurt them, because they've seen and heard about this story of Horton. So stories can be very powerful in showing you the way. So we have to be careful what stories we show to the wee ones, as they say in Ireland.
Yeah, it is interesting, in the especially film industry, there's a lot of films and stories that are built around vengeance, unjust, unreasonable vengeance. And they're actually making heroes out of those who seek vengeance. And so,
Right.
I mean, that's already modeling, kind of giving a template for people that's not going to be helpful to them or to their communities, right? So I think that's...
You can even use that as a teachable moment, because you can say, here's what I would say to 11th graders if they saw something like that. I want you to continue the story and what the community to community relations are likely to be like if this kind of vengeance continues. And then I want you to end the story in how they might come together by reducing that vengeance behaviorally in the heart. So you can use even that as a teachable moment.
That's right. That sounds great. This one now, I don't know how familiar you are with Minnesota Nice, Dr. Enright. I know in the Midwest, every state seems to have their version of Minnesota Nice, at least. And there's a question that came in: how do we overcome the culture of Minnesota Nice that avoids conflict and leaves resentment brewing?
Don't
have any
be
wisdom?
afraid. I would say two things.
Not just moving to Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, well, I got my degree, my Ph.D. at the University of Minnesota. Go Gophers. So I know all about Minnesota Nice. There you go. And I think a key here is don't be afraid of your anger, because forgiveness can lessen that. Some people are afraid to feel their anger, acknowledge their anger, even to express it reasonably to others because they're afraid of it. Also, keep in mind that if you bring up that this is hurting me, you can, through dialogue, reconcile with one another through forgiving and seeking forgiveness. I talk about a fullness of forgiveness is what I call the forgiveness triangle of forgiving, seeking forgiveness, leading to reconciliation. And so let's not be afraid of having a little bit of conflict by saying, when you do X and Y, it hurts my heart. And is there a way out of this? And I recommend people doing it first by forgiving. Because if you can forgive first and then approach the other with justice, the tone will be more mellow, more temperate, okay? The words you use will probably be more just, and you will be patient and waiting for the other to grow on their side of the equation, which is to get it and appropriate, okay, I've done wrong, and that might take months. But eventually, if you're patient, the person might see, what I do does hurt your heart. And this other person might be able to enter into the triangle of forgiveness with you. Forgiving, seeking forgiveness that are not always ripe developmentally at the same way yet, and lead to reconciliation. So let's not be afraid of our anger or to talk with another civilly once we've forgiven. Forgiveness first. Not justice first, you see. Forgiveness first. But let's not forget about justice. Let's then bring it along.
Well, forgiveness first is a good place to end today's session. So I'm really grateful for you and for all those who were able to participate today to join us for this. Thanks so much for the thought-provoking lecture. There's a lot of good material here for us to chew on here at St. Mary's, and I'm sure that those who joined us today will continue to think about what you presented today as in the days to come. So I just want to wish everyone a great and wonderful rest of their day, and just conclude as we traditionally do here at St. Mary's as a LaSallian University. St. John Baptist de La Salle, pray for us. Mary, patroness of our university, pray for us. Live Jesus in our hearts forever. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.